everyone. It is a blustery October afternoon here in Edmonton, and I'm here to talk about Carnival by Rawi Hage. Jess has already posted her video. I'm a little bit late in uploading mine, so if you need some background, go check out her video. She goes through pretty much everything you need to know. Carnival was published in 2012, and yeah, it was an interesting reading experience for me. It was a little bit challenging for me. It's a bit, I don't know, postmodern maybe? It presented some unique challenges to me, and I don't read very much fiction like that, and so it was difficult at first, but once I got into part 2 I really started to enjoy it, and I was really immersed in the narrative and in his style. I'm most interested in discussing the Canadianness of the novel and, I guess, of Rawi Hage. Jess pointed out that it was interesting that this book felt so Canadian to her because, you know, the previous book, Fifth Business by Robertson Davies, also felt Canadian to her. And I guess that speaks to the difficulty in categorizing what Canadian is. You know, so far we've read, this will be our, what god, is it our 4th book? Yeah, this is our 4th book. And all of them are Canadian in very different ways, and which makes sense because we're all Canadian in different ways, and the definition of Canadian is so unique to each person. So I'd be interested in trying to find out what it is about this text that makes it feel Canadian, you know, compared to the Robertson Davies novel that we read, or God, even the Sisters Brothers. What about that as Canadian if it's not set in Canada? I don't know. Be interesting. So the novel takes place in Carnival City, not a real place, so you know we can't place it in the real world. The reason Hage gives for this is that he says that Carnival is more of a temporal novel rather than one that is focused on place. He said, I wanted to do this imaginary place, so not to be tied up with one location. There's a transcendental tendency to go beyond locations in that novel. So it's interesting that he chooses not to place it in any country, really. I mean, it feels a lot like what I imagine Brazil is like, but I mean, it also does feel like Montreal, like Jess had said. And, you know, he has said in writing this novel he drew from his own experiences living in New York City and in Montreal. What does that mean for the Canadianness of the novel? That it's, you know, not only is it not set in Canada, but it's like not set anywhere. I don't know, what do you think? And he also told Brian Lynch of Straight that he'll never be a nationalist. There's this demand sometimes for writers to represent certain nations. For me, it's these pockets of progressive thought and humane community that are dispersed all over the world. For me, that's my nation. He said in a few interviews that I've read that he's more interested in writing about the margins of society rather than, you know, an entire country or an entire society. And so it's interesting that he says he'd never be a nationalist writer, that he sets this novel outside of any place, that he you know, chooses to write about these marginal figures in society. They exist on the fringes, and yet Canada claims him as a Canadian author, and he himself identifies as Canadian. So it's interesting to see that play out in his work versus his life. From that same interview with Straight, he says that's the tragedy of literature, not just Canadian. All nations demand their writers to be some kind of emblem of national figure. And for people who refuse this, they certainly have less support. Maybe I'm not the right person to say these things because of my success. But in general, if you consciously take the position of not belonging to a nation, there's a kind of price to pay. There's a mutual thing, I think. Writers tend to use nation-states, and nation-states tend to claim writers. He goes on to say, I'm not being apologetic, but there are a lot of great things that I like about this country, and I really care about Canada. And when I'm criticizing Quebec or Canada, in a way, the biggest form of nationalism is criticism. I criticize in order to reform, and I'm worried about this place. I think one of those rare great experiments of multiculturalism and liberalism is under assault at the moment. It was interesting reading that and thinking about what, in Carnival, he could have could have been meaning. And there is an absence of nationalism in the novel. The main character is an immigrant, just like Hage is, and Jess had said that she felt a placelessness in the novel, and maybe this is all very intentional and a criticism. I don't know. Hage did an interview with the Montreal Review of Books, and he made an interesting comment about the Canadian novel and the historical novel and what history is in the novel. We have to acknowledge the multiplicity of history. Carnival might not have that linear presentation of a historical book, but every last character is dragging around the memory of certain historical events, like so many cans behind a wedding car. In a sense, this is where it becomes a Canadian novel, Hage says. More and more, part of Canadian history is the history of elsewhere. You have to talk about these histories. I wish that I had read these interviews before I read the novel, because I would love to have had this in my mind as I was reading it, and maybe pay closer attention. Because right now, it's October, and I read this before school started because I knew I would be too busy to read this while I'm in the thick of school. And so many of my initial thoughts and, observations feel very far away from me now, and I can't access them very easily, and I'd like a refresher. And I just thought these were such interesting points about the novel that really applied to what we thought about when we talked about what a Canadian novel is, and while we're trying to decide what makes a novel feel Canadian. Because this novel is so different from Fifth Business, so different, and yet both feel so Canadian. And I don't know if that's something that we're projecting onto these novels because we know they're by Canadian authors, or authors who, identify as Canadian authors, or whether they really do feel Canadian to us. I don't know. This was, like I said at the beginning, a challenging novel for me, and I really enjoyed it, but I know that I have to revisit it to get what I want out of it. It's just holding onto it so tightly, and I need to go back to it. But I loved it. I really loved this novel, and it surprised me because starting out I felt very alienated by it, and I just wasn't getting it. But I think that says more about me than it does about the novel. Towards the middle section all the way to the end, I was very, involved, and I was very interested in it, and I loved it. But there are still things that I need to get out of it, I think. So I'll have to revisit that soon. It was worth it, though, and I'd like to read his other works. Unfortunately, this wasn't a really great review, and it was more me talking a bit about, how Hage frames himself in the Canadian literary context, but I would be interested in hearing what Crotty observed from this novel, and what she thinks in relation to the Canadianness of it. And yeah, these are just some scattered thoughts thrown your way. Did you guys read it? What did you think? What do you think? Am I off base? What do you think? And also, before I sign off, in just a couple of weeks we'll start talking about Dogs at the Perimeter by Madeleine Tien. That is going to be our November book that we'll be discussing. So please go get it. It's so great. It's an excellent novel. It's not very long. You can totally do it in a couple weeks and be ready for our discussions. So with that, I'm going to go. So I can't wait to read some of your comments and hear what you guys thought of Carnival. Okay, have a good one, guys. Bye. Okay, you're a windy day.